Chapter 9. Resurrection and Reconstruction. Quote, "Even as God the Son came and by his incarnation made history the area of victory, so by his continued work, history shall see the further implications of his kingship. Christ as the perfect man did not thereby end history in fulfilling all righteousness, but rather opened up the last days, the great era of the kingdom of God. His resurrection was not a surrender of history and the material world to the devil, but a declaration of his lordship over creation and the promise as the firstfruits of them that sleep of his victory within it. By his virgin birth, his perfect obedience to the law, and his resurrection, he became the last Adam, the fountainhead of the new humanity, and hence the fulfillment of time and history, not the means to escape from it. The death of Jesus was thus the true exodus of the people of God from slavery to freedom, from sin and death to life and righteousness in him. Hebrews 9:15-23 made clear that the death of the testator, Jesus Christ, made his testament law and opened up that inheritance promised and shadowed in the Old Covenant for the people of the New. The material and spiritual blessings promised, therefore, in the Old Covenant begin to come into true force by means of the death of Jesus Christ." End quote. R.J. Rushdoony. The doctrine of Christ's resurrection in history is fundamental to a proper understanding of the progressive conquest of the effects of evil and the curses of God over nature. If we ignore this crucial biblical doctrine, we will be easily misled. It becomes too easy for Christians who focus on the effects of Adam's fall and God's curse of nature to believe that the world is inevitably running down. Such a worldview plays into the hands of zero-growth humanists like Jeremy Rifkin. But Rifkin is more dangerous than simply another zero-growth humanist, for he is self-conscious in his attempt to undermine Christians' faith in the earthly future. He is self-conscious in his attempt to call the dominion covenant into question. He is self-conscious in his denial of future historical progress. In this sense, he is radically anti-Christian. The idea of historical progress. The origin of the idea of progress in history was exclusively Western. It was originally a Christian idea. Only with the widespread acceptance of the biblical concept of linear time did men begin to believe that there could be earthly progress. They began to act in terms of a view of life that says that whatever a man does lives after him, and that future generations will be different to some degree because he lived, worked, and died exactly when he did. Nevertheless, linear history is not in and of itself progressive history. Something more is needed: the idea of compound growth, or positive feedback. It is not simply that history is linear, it is that it is also progressive. Such a view of history rests squarely on Deuteronomy 28, 1-14. It also rests on the notion of covenantal reinforcement, as described in Deuteronomy 8:18. "But thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant which he sware unto thy fathers as it is this day." This is positive feedback. Covenantal faithfulness brings external blessings from God, which in turn are supposed to reinforce people's confidence in the covenant, leading them to greater faithfulness, bringing them added blessings, and so forth. It was the post-millennial optimism of early Calvinism and Puritanism that first introduced this worldview of culture-wide, compounding, covenantal growth to Western civilization. The vision of Deuteronomy 28, 1-14 captivated the Puritans, the external cultural blessings that accompany covenantal faithfulness. The development of the Calvinistic and Puritan doctrine of both spiritual and cultural progress reshaped the West. For the first time in human history, men were given a full-blown idea of progress, which was, above all, a doctrine of ethical progress. This vision was secularized by the philosophers of the Enlightenment, but that secularized version of progress is rapidly fading from the humanist West. Belief in the universality of entropy, meaning inevitable decay, is only one of the causes of this growing pessimism, but it is a powerful one. In the 20th century, quote-unquote pessimillennialism, premillennialism, and amillennialism have been the dominant eschatologies. Those who hold such views have self-consciously rejected the idea of visible, institutional, social progress. They insist that the Bible does not teach such a hope with respect to the world prior to Christ's personal physical return in judgment. I realize that there are premillennialists who will take offense at this statement. They will cite their obligations under Luke 19:13, "Occupy till I come." The original Greek actually says, "do business," not "occupy." New American Standard Bible. Also translated as, "trade with this," New English Bible. But the leaders of the traditional premillennial movement are quite self-conscious about their eschatology, and we need to take them seriously as spokesmen. For example, John Walvoord, author of many books on eschatology and the long-term president of Dallas Theological Seminary, the premier dispensational institution, has not minced any words in this regard. In an interview with Christianity Today, February 6, 1987, Kenneth Kantzer asked, "Kantzer, for all of you who are not post-Mills, is it worth your efforts to improve the physical, social, political situation on Earth?" Walvoord, the answer is yes and no. We know that our efforts to make society Christianized is futile because the Bible doesn't teach it. On the other hand, the Bible certainly doesn't teach that we should be indifferent to injustice and famine, and to all sorts of things that are wrong in our current civilization. Even though we know our efforts aren't going to bring a utopia, we should do what we can to have honest government and moral laws. It's very difficult from Scripture to advocate massive social improvement efforts, because certainly Paul didn't start any, and neither did Peter. They assumed that civilization as a whole is hopeless and subject to God's judgment. He then went on to observe that premillennialists run most of the rescue missions. Quote, "Premillennialists have a pretty good record in meeting the physical needs of people." End quote. This is quite true, but there is no doubt from his words that he does not believe it is possible for Christians to influence the creation of a world in which there will be freedom, righteousness, and productivity, a world in which fewer rescue missions will be necessary. His vision of social action is to get people out of the gutter. This is because his view of the gospel is to take people out of this world, first mentally and then physically, at the rapture. Now, let me say that I believe in the rapture of the saints into the sky at the return of Christ in judgment. As far as I know, every Bible-believing group believes this. What most Christian groups have denied throughout church history is that this gathering of the saints takes place before the final judgment. The rapture of the saints inaugurates the final judgment. There is a tendency for dispensationalists to argue that their opponents have denied the rapture just because they date the rapture at the end of history rather than at the beginning of the 7-year tribulation period or at the beginning of the millennium. The debate within Christianity is not over the reality of the so-called rapture, but only over its dating in history. The non-premillennialists expect the rapture at the close of history. Before the rapture, we will see the public triumph of God's people in history, in every area of life. Jesus said in his Great Commission, "All power is given unto me in heaven and in earth," Matthew 28:18. The positive effects of this covenantal progress of Christ's people in history will be manifested in man's physical environment. Overcoming decay. Physical decay will be completely overcome at the final judgment. All Christians believe this. Henry Morris has commented on this aspect of the final judgment in his exposition of Revelation 22:3. Quote, "The age-long curse is gone. There is no more death and no more sin. The earth and its inhabitants, indeed the entire creation, are henceforth to thrive in fullest vigor forever. None will ever age, nothing will ever be lost, all work will be productive and enduring. The entropy law, the so-called second law of thermodynamics, will be repealed. Information will never more become confused, ordered systems will not deteriorate into disorder, and no longer will energy have to be expended merely to overcome friction and dissipation into non-recoverable heat." End quote. Implicitly, premillennialist scientists have to assume that entropy will be partially overcome during the millennium. Christ returns in his perfect humanity. He rules with perfect knowledge, perfect ethics, and perfect power. All people will obey his perfect words. Their rebellion will be cut short. Thus, I presume that premillennialists would say that there will be, quote, a net decrease in the rate of entropy, end quote, on Earth. Unfortunately, premillennial creation scientists have not discussed the implications of this for their theory of universal uniformitarian entropy. The postmillennial creationist must take a similar but nevertheless different approach. The millennium will not be inaugurated by the physical return of Christ. The kingdom now operates. It will be steadily manifested by the spread of the gospel and by the progressive sanctification of men and institutions. It will not be a mixed economy of eternally living and sin-free people who work alongside death-cursed pre-resurrection people. Men will find ways of using God's gifts, better knowledge, less expensive and less polluting energy sources, better medical techniques, etc., to overcome the quote-unquote natural effects of degeneration processes. Whether the universe's total of entropy will be increased or reduced is impossible to say. Who knows for sure that the universe is a closed system, or what the total of entropy is or will be? How can such a process be measured? The whole question is irrelevant for human action. On this point, we agree with the implicit position of premillennialists, the reduction of entropy's effects during an earthly millennium. As men conform themselves ethically to God, their ability to overcome the cursed effects of the entropy process will increase, just as it increased in the West after the West adopted Christianity. There will be less confusion, less lost information, better techniques of conserving energy and obtaining more of it inexpensively. The cursed effects of entropy, which are what count, not simply the presence of entropy itself in the universe as a whole, will be progressively overcome in time and on Earth. Sadly, Christians have failed to understand the cosmological implications of Christ's death and resurrection. The resurrection of Christ was the definitive overcoming of the cursed aspects of the entropy process announced in history. It points to the final resurrection, final judgment, and final overcoming of the cursed entropy process. In the meantime, we experience the progressive overcoming of entropy's cursed effects. We are promised an extension of human lifespans, Isaiah 65:20, a reduction in sickness, Exodus 23:25-26, and therefore a population explosion. Christianity is a religion of resurrection. Miracles and providence. The creation science movement divides nature into two segments, a scientific realm governed by entropy and a miraculous realm which is governed directly by God. Science applies only to the entropy-bound realm of nature, where quote-unquote natural laws rule. They admit, of course, that this entropy-bound realm is under God's control, for they argue that entropy exists because of God's curse. Nevertheless, they use entropy as a constant, a supposedly mutually agreed-upon constant, in their debates with Darwinians. Clearly, the Bible teaches that God performs miracles. Obviously, these miracles are not governed by the law of entropy. They are comparable to quote-unquote free goods. In a world under God's curse, there are very few free goods. There is scarcity. But even before Adam's fall, there was always some kind of scarcity. It always takes time to accomplish anything. We walk only one step at a time. Adam did before the fall, and redeemed people will also walk this way after the resurrection. Nevertheless, in a capitalist society, we normally see falling prices. If there were no counterfeiting of money, either by private individuals or commercial banks, the increase in the output of goods would tend to force prices lower. This steady increase in production testifies to the ability of men to overcome the effects of scarcity, though not perfectly, not at zero price. Rifkin is outraged by the productivity of capitalism. He says that capitalism is destroying the environment, that we are using up our natural resources. Yet the price of raw materials keeps falling, especially in economies such as Switzerland that do not pour fiat money into the economy. We continue to discover new natural resources all the time. This discovery process has been accelerating for 2 centuries. Per capita wealth continues to rise, exactly as God promised the Hebrews. What we are seeing in economic life is a reduction in the effects of many degradative processes. This indicates that men can overcome these effects through covenantal faithfulness to God, which means obedience to God's economic laws. Western capitalism stands as a historic testimony against Eastern mysticism, and also against any social theory which asserts the dominion of entropy over covenant-keeping man. In short, God's grace to covenant-keeping societies comes through their obedience to revealed covenant law. Deuteronomy 28, 1-14. It is not simply that God promises a miracle now and then in order to break the, quote, steady downward pressure of entropy, end quote. It is that God promises to lift the cursed effects of entropy in response to covenantal faithfulness. The quote-unquote miracle of zero miscarriages, a genetic reduction in entropy, is to become the continuing standard for the whole society God promised Israel. Exodus 23:26. God is not some Eastern karmic force. For every benefit, He does not impose a loss. Two people can trade voluntarily, and both people involved can come out winners. There is no Eastern quote-unquote balance of karma, any more than there is some sort of autonomous balance of nature. We live in a world of covenantal law. The environment responds positively or negatively to mankind in terms of a society's covenantal faithfulness. God promised that the hornets would go before the Hebrews and drive out the perverse Canaanites. God sent plagues on Israel's enemies from time to time, and in response to the evil of the Hebrews, He sometimes sent plagues on them. What this should teach us is that the so-called natural law is covenantal in the same way that miracles are. Natural law is governed by God. Better put, natural law is in fact the very process of God's government over nature. God responds in His ordinary government of the universe to covenant keepers and covenant breakers. Their quote-unquote natural environment either rebels against them or becomes progressively less threatening. What we learn from God's miraculous interventions into the affairs of men, blessings and cursings, is supposed to teach us a principle of God's continuing providential, but non-miraculous, governing of His creation. Reducing the curse's degradative processes. The Darwinian sees no link between man's ethics and nature's laws. This includes New Age mystics such as Rifkin, at least when they are pretending to be scientific. Unfortunately, I see no evidence in the writings of the scientific creationists that they have recognized this link between ethics and nature. They know that the curse will be lifted from nature after the final judgment, but they see this as a totally discontinuous event. They see the arrival of a supposedly zero-entropy world only after history ends. But by the time that day arrives, the cosmic effects of entropy will have created even more noise and confusion in the world than we see today. Creation scientists do not speak of the possibility of a continuous, progressive reduction in the rate of man-threatening decay. They do not discuss the possibility that God promises to reduce His curse of the earth progressively in response to the progressive ethical sanctification of individuals and societies. I contend that at least some of them have refused to discuss this possibility for three reasons. 1. They have adopted something like Rifkin's understanding of entropy. 2. They are eschatological pessimists who have rejected the idea that there can be progressive sanctification in human history. And 3. They are antinomians who have rejected the doctrine of the covenant, which implies the continuing validity of God's revealed covenantal law. In short, they share too many presuppositions with the Darwinians with respect to their doctrine of God, man, and law. There is a legitimate, though unfortunate reason for their silence. They have not read Rifkin. This may be due to a fourth cause for their silence. They are not really interested in social theory. But they should recognize first that physical science at any point in time is shaped by prevailing social theory, including presuppositions about the proper role of science. Second, physical science in turn shapes social theory. Science is not conducted in a social and intellectual vacuum. We need to distinguish cosmological speculation that parades as science from the kind of science that goes on in the laboratory. Obviously, the prevailing cosmology will be restructured when men begin to adopt the biblical view of covenantal blessings and covenantal cursings. Men will be less tempted to elevate a phenomenon such as entropy to a position of supposedly crucial importance for mankind's view of time and space. science will also be affected. When their theological presuppositions shift, men's scientific and cosmological presuppositions will also shift. Science, like all areas of the human intellect, is a very religious endeavor. There is zero neutrality involved. When Christians who have not adopted an eschatology of defeat, but who also maintain belief in the Bible as the only source of valid cosmological speculation, begin to apply themselves to the discipline of natural science, the modern humanistic and mystical version of uniformitarian entropy will no longer be taken seriously in the social sciences. Even today, it can hardly be taken seriously for social science, but a lot of people who bought and read Rifkin's books may not understand this. One of the remarkable ironies about modern cosmological speculation is that all three of the present-day cosmologies, the Big Bang theory, the steady-state theory, few scientists still hold this view, and the oscillating universe theory, were present in early Greek philosophical speculation. The cosmological outlines remain the same, only the footnotes change. What is central to these cosmological theories is the idea of an autonomous universe. God did not create it, He does not sustain it, and He will not judge it. Science is conducted today on the presupposition that men can ignore God in their scientific endeavors. The result is a mental world in which the best minds of science believe that without a human observer, the world of subatomic physics, and perhaps even the reality that the subatomic world supports, is nothing more than statistical wave functions, statistical probabilities. This is highly sophisticated madness. God will not be mocked. To take the theoretical speculations of modern physical science and apply bits and pieces of these intellectual constructs to social theory is to court disaster, personal and intellectual, and possibly even social. If intellectuals begin to take seriously the idea of entropy as the basis of a reconstruction of the world's economy into a steady-state economy, and then they begin to preach such nonsense, we will find the philosophical basis of Western liberty and Western prosperity under attack. If voters take such speculation seriously, we will see the collapse of the world economy. That might make Jeremy Rifkin happy. It should not make Christians happy. Christians should begin to think about social theory. They need to think about the implications of such biblical doctrines as the fall, the curse of the ground, and the resurrection of Christ. They need to think carefully about the relationships between obedience to God's covenantal law and external prosperity, including biological transformations. They need to take seriously the biblical imperative of self-government under law. When they do, they will no longer take seriously Jeremy Rifkin. Conclusion. Orthodox Christianity preaches the triumph of Jesus at Calvary, but this triumph must be seen as threefold: definitive, progressive, and final. To deny the progressive nature of sanctification for the individual is to deny the possibility of personal spiritual maturity and progress. To deny the progressive nature of sanctification for the church is to deny the improvement of the creeds and to deny the healing of society by the preaching of the gospel. To deny progressive sanctification socially is to deny the power of the gospel in history. It is to affirm the progressive power of Satan's followers in history. It is to preach the historic defeat of Christians, the gospel, and the Holy Spirit. This is the ultimate form of pessimism. It is the pessimism that Satan wants Christians to believe above all other kinds of pessimism. This pessimism has deeply crippled the social vision of six-day creationists, who should have been the pioneers of a new anti-humanistic worldview. Because their pessimism regarding the future has dominated their approach to science, they have focused their attention on the fall of Adam rather than the resurrection of Christ. They have made the second law of thermodynamics their key argument, rather than the much better argument that the evolutionists do not have sufficient time available to have made possible the evolution of the universe or the species through natural selection. What we should expect as creationists is that God intends to remove the cursed effects of the fall as Christians mature in history. The cause and effect relationship between man's ethics and nature that brought on God's curse by cursing the second law of thermodynamics still exists. The progressive overcoming of sin in the lives of a growing number of converts will have its effects in nature, a progressive overcoming of the cursed aspects of the universe, including the second law of thermodynamics. When six-day creationists at last admit their mistake and begin to rethink their apologetic strategy, they will begin to produce first-rate social theorists from among their ranks. In summary, 1. Christ did not surrender history at his resurrection. 2. The death of Christ opened up the inheritance of the world to Christians. 3. The idea of progress is a biblical idea. 4. It affirms progressive, linear history. 5. Covenantal faithfulness of Christians brings forth God's external blessings in history. 6. This positive vision of the future has been stolen by various humanist groups since the early 1700s. 7. Dallas Seminary's John Walvoord says that our efforts to reform society are futile. 8. Christ has been given all power on earth, Matthew 28:18. 9. One of the visible effects of this power will be the triumph of the gospel in history, the post-millennial faith. 10. The victory of Christ in history involves a progressive conquest over the physical effects of God's curse. 11. Creation scientists admit this with respect to the world beyond the final judgment. 12. They implicitly assume this partial triumph during the millennial reign of Christ, but they never talk about it. 13. The postmillennialist sees this conquest over the curse as progressive. 14. This is a consequence of Christ's resurrection and his empowering of the church in history. 15. Miracles testify to the incomplete reign of entropy. 16. Capitalism's economic growth also testifies to the ability of men to overcome entropy's cursed effects. 17. Rifkin hates capitalism. 18. In voluntary trade, entropy's cursed effects are overcome. Both people win. 19. Man's total environment responds positively to a society's covenantal faithfulness. 20. Darwinists deny any link between ethics and the operations of nature. 21. Creation scientists have not publicly challenged the Darwinists on this point. 22. They seem to have adopted Rifkin's views concerning entropy. 23. They are also eschatological pessimists, as Rifkin is. 24. They agree with Rifkin that obeying biblical law cannot restore the fallen world. 25. Science is never neutral. 26. Scientists are heavily influenced by the prevailing worldview of scientific culture. 27. If creation scientists were self-consciously covenantal and optimistic, this would be reflected in their attitudes toward the thesis of the universal reign of entropy. 28. The universe is not autonomous. 29. We must not transfer to social theory humanist theories of autonomous nature. 30. Christians must begin to think seriously about social theory. 31. They must abandon Jeremy Rifkin's pagan social theory. 32. Christians must begin to have faith in God and in history. 33. Pessimism toward the success of the gospel in history paralyzes Christians in their efforts to rethink social theory. 34. Pessimism regarding the triumph of the gospel in history is the worst sort of pessimism possible. 35. It is just this pessimism that has crippled the worldview of creation scientists.